Hello, and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president.
Well, Colleen, as always, great to be with you again.
It's good to be with you too, Father. And today we're going to be talking about euthanasia, particularly about the situation in Canada at the moment, and then we'll move into a little bit of a discussion of politically how we can stop that from gaining traction in America and how we can combat euthanasia legally.
Very good. Well, it'll be a great discussion because this is something that we, any of us who have been following the conversation regarding legalization of euthanasia, whether it be here in the States, as we see in some of the states, or we see in other countries. I think it's just good for our audience just to be aware that, this is another example of the assault on life. And this time we're talking about the disabled, the sick, or the terminally ill.
And in a future podcast, we're going to try to discuss the particulars of what people in these situations can either caring for loved ones or can expect to, what they can expect.
Sure.
So that should be a follow-up episode coming shortly. But for today, we're going to talk about it more from a legal point of view.
Very good.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So let's just jump right in. So you mentioned in your article this week, Roger Foley, who was a gentleman in Canada who encountered pressure to be euthanized, I believe. So
right.
Can you just talk a little bit about that situation?
Sure. I'll kind of pull in two. Just in the sense of Roger Foley, and then I mentioned, in the column also a Canadian veteran, that and there are two links to the stories so that people who are really interested in reading more about these situation in more in a fuller way, please, consult those links because that's why we include them, to show people, one, we've done our research, number two, it's usually these kinds of stories that sparks my interest. Some people in our audience may have even sent me some. So I'm very grateful, the people that send emails or suggestions because there's so much out there that a lot of times it's hard to narrow the focus. But I try to use current issues that are out there regarding whether at the beginning of life or at the end of life or those stages in between. This is an example of one where Roger Foley is, dealing with a degenerative disease, and he's suffering from this. And so he's in the hospital and he's being pressured, by the hospital personnel, doctors, those in nursing care, to kind of consider, if you will, kind of pushing, not just consider, pushing him toward, this mindset. Roger's going to cost a lot of money, to care for you on a daily basis. Roger, how are you feeling today? Do you feel depressed? And I am being a little sarcastic and cynical here with my tone, because this is exactly what the man's encountering. People coming in and, hey, Raj, how you doing today? Just to kind of, putting within the man's mindset, don't you, in a way, don't you feel a burden? Don't you feel depressed by the situation you're in? And so instead of, recognizing, that Roger, Mr. Foley has a difficulty, his life is of value. He is of tremendous value, irreplaceable value, and an absolute value. Just reiterate this. And, but he's being made to feel that his life is being determined by a quality, and not himself as a person, but the medical condition that he's dealing with. So, and they're trying to use this, to encourage him maybe to request physician-assisted suicide, and so which would be legal in Canada. And so, and the other situation is a gentleman that was suffering with post-traumatic, go get that one on, post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTS, Daddy here is, post-traumatic stress syndrome. So I think it's important, or depression. And so it's a struggle, this gentleman is dealing with, which is real. And so now he's being pushed, to not only pushed, but to the point of saying, we can't help you with this, all we can offer you is the termination of your life. Now, so I want you to really, Colleen, to think about this, and our audience to consider how many men and women come back from different situations in the United States, serve in our country, dealing, with PTSD, dealing with this situation, and and coming in, and this is all that our country is going to say to them. Here, you've served your country, you've done, you've given your sacrifices, you have done so much to advance our freedom, to protect us, from unjust aggression. And this is what we're going to say to you. Your life no longer has value. This, of course, this is not how they say it, but this is the impression. So Mr. Foley, going back to him, is in a situation where he is in a hospital, he's in a vulnerable state, and what he needs is care, what he needs is support, what he needs is good counsel, what he needs is for others to recognize the value of his life, but and not to have people try to diminish the value of his life, make him consider something that is not the answer, to his situation. It doesn't actually resolve, his medical situation. It resolves Mr. Foley, is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
It ends his life, as we've seen in cases with those diagnosed with Down syndrome, and we've talked about before. So
prenatally, though.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but it's still an act of discrimination.
Oh, definitely.
We're discriminating against a person because of a disability, because of a certain situation that they may find themselves in, or because they're in a certain stage of development. So I think it's important for people to see, what's happening here. It's a quality of life definition that's being applied.
Well, and it sounds like they're also trying to make him feel like he's a burden. Like, oh, you're going to cost us this much money to stay alive each day. Like, if you have someone who's already suffering and already sick and they hear that, that just makes them feel like they're a burden on everyone around them.
Exactly.
Just pushes them further down, like spiraling down that road.
Exactly. And we need to realize that Canada is not the only place where, physician-assisted suicide, is available, and legal, let's just say, not just available, but legalized. And so, but I want us, to really, consider the mindset of what this does. So by mindset, the kind of four things we want to look in sense of direction. A mindset is an approach, a view. So by legalizing, physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, what do we have? So we have two different kinds of act. An act of euthanasia is where a doctor, participates, or gives a person a drug causing their death. Physician-assisted suicide is where, if, like, for example, in this situation, let's use me, that I ask to be assisted in the termination of my life. So the doctor, in this situation, says this is the medication, here is the switch. The doctor is not the direct cause per se, but I am. I push this button, I get the injection, or I take a pill, whatever the dynamic is, and so I'm the cause. I'm assisted, but the doctor is not the main cause. And the other, it is the physician or the acting agent, that's participating there. So in Canada, so this is where, not the only country, I wrote them down so that our listeners really catch this. So Belgium, people would be probably more familiar with, the Netherlands, obviously, but Colombia, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Spain, and then there are several states within Australia, as there are many states here in the United States, where it is legal. So
euthanasia or assisted suicide, or both?
It depends. It could be both. Okay. And so, but in this situation, you see where in different countries, this mindset. So think about what the mindset does. As we know, like with abortion, once something's legalized, it puts into motion a culture in itself. It sets into motion a mindset that life can be determined arbitrarily to have value or not to have value. And so as we see at the beginning of life, now we see in here in moments of disability, or issues of terminal illness, or a person who just really is, quote unquote, tired of living. And so this is what we're dealing with. Then it creates a behavioral pattern. This is where John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae speaks about when he gets to the sections on euthanasia, which kind of flow throughout the entire document. But as you get towards paragraphs, 60 and following, he really addresses the issue. And so the behavioral pattern, as we see with abortion, with our pregnancy care centers, for example, is our way of intervening, our way of saying we're here to help you, so you're not alone. At the end of life, we have the same dynamic happening. People who feel alone, isolated, who maybe are feeling themselves burdened, by the illness, by the difficulty, or being made to feel as if they are a burden. So in that regard, like John Paul would say, this is where we have to enter in again. It's, supporting those in these situations, being present to those. So the mindset leads to a cultural behavior, which then leads to practices. So as we see with Mr. Foley, the mindset is there. We see a behavioral pattern emerging, in a culture, in a society, in a country in this case. And then we see practices within medical personnel, within those in health care that really should be protecting life now have a practice, at least with the people that is in this case. I can't speak to all, and nor would I try, but there's a mindset, a behavioral pattern, now a practice that begins to happen. So, and then it becomes a direction. And so this is what's happened here. And so in the other countries I make note of, some of them have been doing this now for decades, even recently lowering the age for those that can ask for euthanization or to have a physician and help them in that process. So it's arbitrary. It's never respectful of human life. It's always an intrinsic evil in itself, which we've talked about before, and what that means, that in and of itself, it cannot be chosen because it is an evil act. It is a disrespect toward human life. It is a disregard to the respect that is owed to every human person, regardless of their state in life, regardless of a disability, regardless of their stage of development. So I say this so that it helps us to understand what we're up against. And as the countries, very tragically, who have already embraced this, or who are growing that availability, or other countries like here in the U.S. that are making this mindset more readily available legally, this is not a good, Colleen. This is something that we need to address, and that's why I took advantage of the articles in the AP on Mr. Foley and the one I picked up on the Canadian veteran, just to show, hey, look, this is not far across our border. So wake up, people.
Well, and it sounds like it sounds like it's like the overtaxed health system that's part of it too. That they have a large aging population, and then they're trying to force this on, you have an older population and they don't have the medical system to deal with it, so now they're pushing it more. But I think you also mentioned that it was legalized in 2016, and when it was legalized, it was narrow, but since then the floodgates have just burst open.
Right.
Which is obviously, whenever you get that little foot in the door there, it's going
That's correct.
to. So
and that's a good thing, Colleen, to say, because that is always and has been the case. You know, once you put that little toe in the door and you try to keep it narrowly focused, we know the practice has been, it just opens the door completely. And that's what happened in Canada, and that's what's happening even here in the States as well.
And I know when you mentioned in your article that there was a recent legal development. Can you just go into a little bit of what is about to occur in Canada if Trudeau's government goes through with their...
Yeah, I mean, if this obviously, you know, basically it's just, the only way to say it was that there's no limitation. You know, that's just basically what's going to happen.
Okay.
You know, is that if once this mindset, you know, begins to move, you start seeing where, as Trudeau's wanting to advance, is that it becomes a limitless possibility to people.
Because he's opening it up for the mentally ill, I believe, is
right.
What
So that's exactly. So what it's done now is, so again, now we're choosing a particular segment, which is really an act of discrimination. You're discriminating against a particular group of people who, for whatever reason, are in some type of cognitive disability. You know, that could be caused, you know, from birth in a sense of a genetic disability, or it could be something that happens because of an accident, a stroke. You know, so many dynamics that occur. But what Mr. Trudeau is doing here is very simply what the culture of death does. It is arbitrarily determined who has value, who does not have value. And who is the arbiter in this situation? It is always, Colleen, the person with power. It's always the person that exercises power over another human being. And so government should not be in any place in that kind of decision making, nor should a person who's a doctor, you know, in that situation, who has authority. And so, but let's peel it back further. This is never an option anyway. We should never, ever be in a situation where a life is determined to be of value. Every life is of value. Every life is of value. This is what we mean by human dignity. And it's never lost, Colleen. You know, whether a person does struggle with a mental disability, whether a person is, you know, now a handicapped and for other reasons, you know, a person of elder age, or a person who's in a traumatic accident and has lost their ability to function physically. You know, it maybe could be, you know, completely paralyzed. You know, these are just a few examples. But this is what's out there. So, but I'm wondering, you know, to our brothers and sisters across the border, you know, when they hear Mr. Trudeau say this, what comes to mind? You know, what does anything really say, wait a minute here? You know, why all of a sudden are we, you know, we opening this door? But you mentioned something, Colleen, that is also part of this conversation, is healthcare in general, the cost of healthcare. What is it actually costing, to care for individuals? So that makes this conversation, become more current in a sense of how does government, how do communities, care for our sick, care for our elderly, care for our handicapped. The answer is never euthanasia, and it's never physician-assisted suicide. But there is a legitimate question about how do we care? How do we pay for such coverage? What are our limitations? But that's a different question that needs to be addressed and how we address it. But never should it be thought that the way to resolve those questions is by taking the life of those human beings that are dealing with and suffering with those difficulties. So that's what needs to be said.
Exactly. It's the root of the problem. Like the root of this problem is that you need to figure out not efficient in like the like machine, but efficient as in a way to care for people that is, I don't want to say cheap because that doesn't make it sound good, but in a way that's reflective of their dignity, in a way that they can receive the support they need without it being a burden on other. Not like they're a burden, but the care for them could seem like a burden because of the financial costs. So a way to alleviate the financial burden without eliminating the person.
Right. Well, maybe think of it this way: is that every person must be respected everywhere, every time, in every situation.
Exactly.
Now, with that said, there are going to be limitations of resources. So it means that the person is always to be respected, always to be served, always to be loved, always. But there could be the fact that there's limited resource. What I mean by resource could be a family's ability. Now, and that doesn't move us toward euthanization or physician-assisted suicide. It just accepts the reality, like I see in other countries, because of the lack of availability that we might see in a first world nation, which is a question of distributive justice. That's another issue to talk about. But there are many times in countries that are still developing where they don't have access to certain medications. They don't have access to medical health care as we do here. Again, that's a very important thing we need to talk about. That's for another segment, a podcast, with the idea here of how do we deal with those injustices. But, I'll give you an example. When I was doing mission work in the Yucatan a number of decades ago, a young mother came in with 3 children. This is an example where, the one of the children was ill, and the baby in this case, and they were coming for the bishop. The archbishop was coming to the village to do baptisms and confirmations. But, the baby was dying because there was nothing within the local medical institutions that could resolve those issues. But if there would have been resource, in other words, if we had had an unlimited budget of resource, we could have flown the whole family, to the Mayo Clinic or to a major hospital in the United States that might have had a very different outcome. But, the baby would eventually succumb to the illness because there was nothing available in that region to be able to serve the mother and to serve the life of that child in that regard. So the point being is the child was loved, child was cared for, child was welcomed, child received the sacraments of the church, was held to the very end because the child was loved.
They did everything possible that they could with the resources that they had.
So the child is not a burden, the never to be considered a burden, and the very fact that this baby was loved by this mother and loved by the family, but there was a limitation. Now we can discuss, later, it's a shame that occurred because, like I said, in other countries, this baby would maybe have lived with the resources of healthcare available. But I think what we're talking about is a whole segment of conversation about healthcare and the rights to healthcare, which really flow from the dignity of the human person. But we're going to save that for another day, and hopefully our audience will, I want to hear more about that. So we'll come back to that another day. But in this moment, what we're dealing with is, 2 individuals, 2 very different, medical situations that need to be cared for, that are not thinking in any regard about ending their life. They're not thinking that their life is a burden.
Well, even if they were thinking that doesn't make it any.
Right, exactly.
It's still dreadful no matter what.
Exactly.
But, yes.
But the idea here is that they're being made to feel that the only solution, quote unquote, to my situation is the termination of my life.
Which is never the right
never,
approach.
Ever. So I think it's important, part of me, that we realize This mindset is creating a culture within the culture. And that's what John Paul called the culture of death. I mean, it's setting itself in opposition, to the culture of life that respects every life and sees the value of human life. And so we have to realize that this is happening around us. And if we're in different states, here in the United States that are advancing such agendas, it is important for us to fight against this and to recognize this is an evil. It's an assault on human life. It is never the answer to a person's situation. And even if an individual themselves may be thinking this way, still does not make it just, still does not make it right, and doesn't all of a sudden make something that is evil into something good. You can never cause or hasten one's death, or I cannot hasten or cause my own death. That is never acceptable, and it's never moral, and we should be against this completely as a culture. But as we know, Colleen, because we live in a permissive and culture that has embraced, sadly, not everyone, but as a culture, tragically, the culture of death's mindset. And it's changing our behaviors every day. And it's causing practices to occur, policies, procedures,
That's not truly caring for the person either. It's trying to eliminate what they see as a problem. It's not actually caring for the person and helping them deal with their pain or work through their pain or heal their pain. It's
right. And it also doesn't call me, to the equation. So in other words, quote unquote, I've been removed from the equation. But John Paul would say in Evangelium Vitae, it's not about an I, it's about a we. So it's about how we are in this conversation, that this person is not alone, that we are here with you, for you. We're going to accompany you. Pope Francis talks about accompaniment all the time. And it's a great word. And it's an important word that we are not isolated. We should not feel isolated. We're part of a community. We are social beings. We're part of a family. But let's be honest here. We have certain segments of our society that now are in the elder part of their life, and they maybe are alone. They may have lost all their immediate family. Their close relatives don't live anywhere near them. And so now, in a way, they, quote, are alone. But we need to say, you're not alone. You're part of our faith community. You're part of our community. And you're part of this local community. And that means we have to knock on their doors. What can I do to help you? What do you need? Even those that are in nursing care facilities that are oftentimes, quote, dropped off and, end quote, and left alone. Unacceptable. Yeah. This is we have to change the mindset.
Yes.
Which then changes the behavioral patterns, which goes against the policies and practices and sets a new direction. This is the culture of life. This is what we're talking about.
You're doing the both and. You're putting the finger in the dike to stop that floodgate from opening up. And then on the flip side, you're trying to build a culture where that's unthinkable.
Exactly.
And you're actually truly caring for the person as for everything they are.
That's
and
right.
Not just...
That's right. Yeah, and so I think that these two kind of situations that are in Canada, hopefully, that many people who listen to our podcast, and, because HLI is a global pro-life movement and working in many countries across this world, we see in countries where this is not even a mindset. For example, you come into Africa, you would not see this as a mindset. Doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not a mindset. But as the culture of death continues to push itself and advance, then this mindset goes in. So you have in cultures around the world where caring for a loved one is the mindset. Where like I was raised. Our grandparents were in our homes or shared among the children in a sense of care. My godmother died in my grandmother's home. This was something that was the mindset. It wasn't that, oh, you're going to be over there and I'm over here. No, you need care, and we're going to be here to help you. And yes, there are limitations. Sometimes we needed to be in an assisted living situation because we couldn't provide, the level of health care. But it doesn't mean they were over there again. We drove every day. We were in their room every day. We were washing their clothes. We were bringing them food. We were visiting. In other words, it's important to see the value of family. And I have a very dear friend, and I won't say it because she does listen to our podcast, so I'm not going to embarrass her. But, there was a woman that I knew in one of my parishes. She lived to be, I want to say 105, but it might have been 103. But she was married, She was an Army nurse. Her husband died they were never able to have children, but he had passed many years before. And because of this loving friend of mine, who adopted basically this wonderful lady, and she lived a very long life because of the love and care. And there was a point where she couldn't be in her own home, and so this family couldn't bring her into their home because they didn't have the setup. But she lived in an assisted living and eventually into a healthcare facility. But this friend of mine was there every day. And because of that, the nurses, the staff, the mindset was, again, and I mean this in a respectful manner, someone's watching.
Yeah.
Which means this person is being looked after. But that should be the mindset for every person, whether someone's there every day looking after them. That should be the mindset of every healthcare, every attendant, everyone working in those facilities. But we know that's not the case. And it's similar to a situation where there was a former parishioner of mine who had suffered from dementia and eventually into full-blown Alzheimer's. And, eventually to the point where, I think I might have shared this recently, but please, our audience forgive me if I'm sharing the story again, but where she had pointed to the point where she would always take her clothes off. Mm-hmm. And she didn't know what she was doing. But this woman I knew for almost a decade, very dignified, beautiful lady, would have been horrified to know what she was doing. And so I go to see her and in the nursing facility, and I find her unclothed. So I put a sheet, or I get her clothes, and then I walk my way right to the nursing station. And they were waiting for it. They knew when I was coming. And I said, I want you to imagine, this is a human being. This is a person of great value. And whether or not she doesn't know what she's doing, always has her clothes on, you have to treat her in a way as you yourself would want to be treated. Think of her as your grandmother, your mother. Would you want that to happen? And of course, they'd always say, no, Father, but. There's no but. There's not a what if here. Is that she needs to be treated with the utmost of respect. And so we have to do it for her. And even if we got to put her clothes on 5 times a day, 10 times a day, we have to find a way to do this. But that's a mindset that we have to create. And staff is understaffed. Yes, they're overworked. I mean, yes, that's all real.
But it shouldn't be all on the healthcare workers. It should be on families and communities to be able to step in and
exactly,
be able to provide that.
Exactly, Colleen. And I think that's the real issue here that John Paul was raising, is that, how does that phrase go? It takes a community to raise a barn, the old adage. Well, it does. When, this is, again, not to speak of myself, but I was very blessed to be raised in a faith community within a church parish that had that mindset. Mm-hmm. And I was taught this by my elders, that they would, quote, drag me along with them and, quote, to homes to visit the sick, the elderly. But I watched these wonderful people care for people that were not related to them at all. But these were parishioners, these were friends, these were people that they saw growing up. And they were there for them. They would bring them food, they would bring them, the sacraments, and build, they needed a handicap ramp, they built it for them. If they needed a bathroom fixed, they fixed it for them. In other words, it was care. And we, in a way, sadly to say, we've lost this, not across the board, not completely. There are great people out there, beautiful people doing wonderful things. But as a country, as a nation, I think we have lost that mindset of my neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Well, everyone's my neighbor. We've lost that, Colleen. And I think that this kind of reality in the story that I mentioned about Mr. Foley and the veteran from Canada, and we can put many names in here, just tells us what's been lost and what's been replaced, what's replaced it. And I got to tell you, it frightens me. Yeah. This mindset really frightens me, because I could be in a situation where I completely am dependent upon the care of others. And, I'm not married. I don't have a wife and children. I have family, I have friends, but there's a limitation to what they can do. So there is a fear that many people right now have. What happens to me?
Especially as society gets more isolated and you have a little bit of like the mushroom population where the older generation, there's so many, and then there wasn't, because of abortion and contraception and sexual revolution and all of that, it's kind of narrowed down the number of kids people have had. So you have a smaller subset, or a smaller set of younger people who are trying to care for a large set of older people, and so I think it's a challenge for us to make sure that we're actually right there for the people in our communities.
And wouldn't you add also to that, Colleen, that the fact that we are seeing less and less practice of faith?
Yes.
So, I mean, what I'm talking about and what you're talking about is a woman of faith and a man of faith. That really shapes my mindset. You know, our religious values, our core values shape us. They shape how we approach each other, how we approach other people. And so, but as that also, you know, lessens, it has an impact. And what you said, and you know, when I was being raised, we all lived relatively near each other. We live in a very mobile culture today.
And an isolated culture as well.
And so it's, and I remember in parish ministry, many times in visiting the homebound, they would say, "Oh, Father, I would never want to be a burden." And boy, I jump on that real quick and correct the mindset, you know, that we should never ever feel or be made to feel. So it tells you it's out there. I mean, and it's very much a part of what people are thinking as they become older and more isolated and even more dependent. I mean, I think all of us, you know, and I saw this in caring for, you know, terminally ill priest and caring for older priests, and having had the joy of caring for some of my older mentors, you know, that I'm very blessed to have had the privilege. And I watched them go from very independent men to very dependent men. And it was very hard. It was hard for them, you know, to lose his sight, not be able to drive, not be able to go where he wanted to go. It's very frightening, you know, and, you know, but these men were men of faith. They trusted and believed, and look, they were well cared for. I mean, the community came front and center, you know. So that's what I'm saying. It really is, our faith does really shape us, but the reality of being alone, the reality of being dependent, having someone to bathe you and clean you, and it can be a very difficult place and somewhat embarrassing. So, but at that stage, you know, talking about that, but we that's why I'm saying all this is part of this. But this is again where we come into the conversation. And I remember just another story. My dad is an example. You know, I remember this wonderful gentleman that was not a family member, but needed extra care, and because of his size, it was hard for his family, his wife and others. My dad would go twice a day, bathe him, help them, and this. So as I'm saying, I'm very fortunate, blessed, you know, to have been given example. You know, that my dad went out of his way, you know, and not because of an obligation, but because he cared.
I remember we had the same thing growing up. Our neighbor was elderly and lived alone and had no family, and I think his house, it had running water, and I think it had electricity, but it was like knob and tube electricity. This was, he cut his lawn with a push mower that wasn't electric. It was just like...
The manual, yeah.
Exactly, the manual. So he had the bare minimum, and I remember his caretakers, the nurse that would come and check on him, coming over one time when I was very little to ask my dad for help because he'd fallen and she couldn't pick him up. And my dad's like, "Yep, we're going to go over," and walked over and helped him, and my family would just do what they could to keep an eye out on him and make sure that... I think there was another time that he'd fallen that my dad went to go check on him or something. But just having that example at a very young age, because he died when I was about 7.
But isn't it a blessing to think about? We're sitting here,
yeah, because
of the example of others who showed us a value, and we can't ignore that. I mean, this is why, you know, what John Paul is saying is so beautiful, that, you know, that when we have this kind of mindset and this behavior becomes a part of us, it becomes we witness to others, and then we ourselves become an example that hopefully inspires others to become more involved. And we're sitting here because of their witness, because of the example of others. I mean, we could have rejected it. We had the freedom to do so, but we didn't. We realized that this is a great value. And so here we both are, you know, here to defend life. We're here to talk about the beauty of human life. And here we are talking about a subject that's very real to us because we saw it fully in front of us. Like the example that your dad you gave and the example I just gave. That is what we have to advance. So, and this is the challenge, I think, before the culture of life. I mean, we have many preeminent issues. The assault at the beginning of life is one of these major issues that we have to keep addressing, and we are. But now that the assault is an aging population, as you just noted, where we have an inverted pyramid, you know, a population pyramid, where we have an older population and a younger population in smaller amount, how do we care for our sick? How do we care for our elderly? How do we care for our handicapped? And so the culture of death says, well, we just can't provide the resources, we can't provide the care, that level that you need. So, the answer is euthanize you, physician-assisted suicide. Very similar to the same argument, differently made, but in the beginning, I can't afford this child, I'm in a difficult situation, for many, many reasons that women find themselves in those dilemmas, and being pushed in those moments, being made to feel that they're all alone, they're isolated, there's no one there to help them. Story sounds very, very familiar, and it is, because it's a very, very similar story. And as the answer is at the beginning of life, it is the same answer toward this latter part, or in phases of disability or of illness or old age. The answer is never the death of an innocent, vulnerable person, ever. And so and I think that's why I'm so passionate about this, and so are you. And I think that's why we're enjoying the subject, but the subject is, we're passionate about it because it's very real, and it's something that we realize there's something wrong here. And that's why I bring this subject up many times throughout the year, that when I write on this, to keep it front and center. The answer is not. That's why I would say, Colleen, that my suggestion to all of our listeners is we need to get in touch with local legislators. We need to become more actively engaged. As I've said in this podcast, and I've said in my articles numerous times, when I speak, the church speaks of life, we're speaking from the very beginning of life at fertilization, all the way to its natural end, and everything in between.
I'm glad you brought that up, Father, because I was going to ask you a little bit about the legal side of things. What can our listeners in Canada do? What can we in America do? So contact legislatures. Do you have any other suggestions?
There are a number of groups working specifically in this in each country.
Okay.
So I know of a number in Canada, and I think people just need to Google pro-life groups that are working in the issues of euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide. They're usually working in the same topic, and become involved. Support them. Find ways that you can support them in working with the legislature, working with local government, and fighting against the Trudeau mindset.
Yes.
This is wrong, and it should be labeled as an act of discrimination. And that especially right now, as the one you had talked about, where he's trying to advance against those with labeled, quote, with a mental, disability.
Does that include, do you know if that includes like depression as well, or?
Well, as you said in the very beginning, Colleen, think about this. So even if it doesn't say it now,
it will.
The window opens. Yeah. Because the moment that you make one inroad into arbitrarily decided, because again, think about this, it's arbitrary. Yeah. Who's determining a level of, quote, mental handicap here?
And that's targeting people at their weakest.
You absolutely.
If you're struggling with depression or PTSD.
Right. That's right. Who have no ability, to fight for themselves. And, and you said PTSD so easily, and I couldn't say it earlier that quickly. So, very good. But it's just the idea that, yes, exactly. They're labeling. They literally are labeling. They're stigmatizing, but think what that does in the culture. Mm-hmm. It creates a mindset in the culture. Oh, those people. And that's very, very unhealthy, across on any level. And so that's why I think people need to get involved, Colleen, on that local level, and realize that this is not healthy for a culture as a whole, because that culture of death mindset will eventually move into other areas. So where we begin to, example, it sounds fictitious that, this will never happen, but why couldn't we just make a certain age? People need to go back and look at the sci-fi, called Logan's Run. Now, I'm not going to explain it, but anyone of my age bracket will remember that particular show. And it was about euthanization, all right? And so here we are, a certain number of people, arbitrarily chosen, time for you to end your life. So this is a mindset that we have to fight. So I would say in Canada, here in the United States, those states that right now do not have this, we ought to find out what's being advanced in the state. Mm-hmm. Because the whole culture of death, those advancing this are doing so in little ways in many states that people don't even see yet.
Well, they change the terms, as always. That's one that you run into a lot with this. You see death with dignity, you see all of these phrases that are not true. And I think even just changing how people talk about it is changing a mindset. And so even if, obviously fight back on the legal level, fight back by caring for people around you, which you should be doing even if you're not fighting back, but also just making sure that you're using terms that are not just playing into their...
Right, what we often know as euphemisms, death with dignity, compassionate care. There's so many ways that they try to disguise their action. But I want to just play a little bit more clean. I know we're getting, toward the end of our podcast, but, I just want to, what you just said, pick up on. And that is, what could we do at the local level? So I returned back to parish ministry when I in my last diocesan assignment. And that is, how do we visit our homebound? How do we reach out to our elderly in the community? How are we, visible? Now, and I'm not just saying the priest. Mm-hmm. Yes, Father is going to be visible, bringing the sacraments, but how do the people of God, what about our next door neighbor? What about the lady the street over that no one's seen in a while? How are we, engaging? And maybe we need to create a 501c3 in our community that it's about caring for our neighbor. Just even call it loving our neighbor, and so that way we answer the question, everyone's my neighbor. People are afraid right now in this culture because they've been isolated. And because we're living in such a divisive culture right now that's being advanced, we need to fight against that. And so the tendency is to bunker down. No, right now Jesus sends us out. We have to go out. And so I would encourage people, to form, very active communities within the community that really are looking out. I noticed this in Louisiana, after a major storm, that I'm always, it shows the beauty of the human person. When people are in a vulnerable situation, and there's a great need to see so many people come out. They're all hurting. So many have been hit by this massive storm, but yet here we are. What can I do to help you? And it shows the goodness of people. There's a good nature within the human person that realizes that we have a need. And I've noticed this, that, someone themselves may have had the same amount of damage. So they get their family taken care of first, they get everything secure, and then they walk over. What can I do to help you? My own dad, who's, approaching 80, and the neighbors were amazed, that he's out there. What do you need? What can I help? And so it just shows, but he wasn't alone. There were so many people doing that. That's what we need to do in our communities. And we do a good job, when it comes to other ways of advocating. This is one that we need to advocate for. This is an example of one among many, but this is a major one that we need to get engaged in. So I would say that's one thing I would encourage.
And it's a major one, but it's also one that I think that gets neglected a lot. Because it's very easy to go, oh, end-of-life care, babies, cute. And then or not end-of-life care, early life care. Right. It's very easy to, I think, naturally, people want to love small things. But then you get to end-of-life care, and I think there's this fear of what if I'm like that someday. And so I think really being able to confront that in yourself and realize that might be a fear and work through it and just recognize the dignity of the human person.
Exactly. And what I would add to that is also caring for the caregivers. Mm-hmm. We lose sight of that as well. We have wonderful families who are caring for a person of great need in their home that's not terminally ill, that's not dying from any illness, but may have a handicap and bedridden, and so the caregiver is also someone that needs care. Someone that needs to give a little time to, maybe for a lady, go get her hair done, or go shopping, or go to the doctor, just run errands. What can we do to volunteer? To go, I'll sit with your son, I'll sit with your daughter. What can I do I'll run your errand for you. Something that you need to be done. It's how do we do this? There could be someone, we did this in one of the assignments where, during the summertime especially, high school students, go cut the grass. Family members would identify an elderly person or a person that's been ill, and we would go there, adult supervision, and go there and take care of their yard. Go shopping for them. Maybe there was things at errands that need to go to the post office. It's amazing what these little things do and the sacrifices that people do, what they speak and what they say of a community and what they say about people. And that to me is how we fight against that legislation. We have to fight against it from a legal point, absolutely. Voting in people that are going to, stand for the dignity of human life. We need to create policies and laws that are going to respect the dignity of every human life. We need to reject the anti-life legal system that's out there. And at the same time, let's just get practical. Let's get down to the other base levels, and that is, what are we doing in our community? Our food banks are a good example of great work, advocacy. Our clothes stores for the needy, very good way of advocating. But there are so many ways of advocating. This is another example.
Well, not becoming complacent either.
Right.
Even though some things may not be legal right now, doesn't mean that they couldn't be down the road. So if you form that culture where that is unthinkable, you can kind of stop it before you ever get to that
Exactly.
point.
And I think that is the perfect way to summarize that, Colleen, because I think that's it, where it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I know that's what John Paul was mentioning in Evangelium Vitae. That's exactly the mindset. Because then after that, it creates a behavioral pattern. Mm-hmm. And it puts people into practical application immediately. And then it sets a direction for a people. And it sets a direction for a culture. Now, here we're talking about the common good. We're talking about the role of government. The role of government is not to harm human persons, but to serve human persons and to help human persons to flourish. So that is a perfect way, Colleen. That's a good way that we should title the program. That's a good way, to do that. And I hope that becomes reality.
I feel like most of our podcasts are boiling down to, hey, let's change the culture so this bad thing isn't unthinkable, and that's not a bad thing.
No,
at all. It's
not at all.
Exactly what we should be doing.
That's, I said that it goes back to by John Paul. Is you have two realities confronting each other: the culture of life and the culture of death. So you have, and it's interesting. I recently did a presentation on John Paul's visit to the United States in 1976, and he talks about this long before, a few years before he would be elected as the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Faith Church. And so what happens? He talks about a great confrontation between two very different visions. And this Holy Father, that would be one of the things he would take charge, to elevate to the universal platform, and everything he did, whether it was the United Nations, whether it was his pastoral visits to countries, whether it was in his encyclicals, apostolic exhortations, his Wednesday audiences, even to the point of his last visit in the window, to give a blessing, and a few days later would die. A man suffering with Parkinson's, suffering with a disability that from the secular point would have said, his life has no value anymore. He can't go anywhere anymore. He can't speak anymore. Can't do anymore. They would have judged him on a quality of life definition. But yet this man, with all the beauty and dignity that every person has, even in the latter part of life, even facing a terminal illness that would eventually cause his death, he stood there with great love and witnessed to the world. I will never forget the image. It's a powerful testimony. And so that's what I'm saying. He took this to every place. Now it's ours. It's our job now.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Father. Is there anything, is that you?
No, I think that's a great way. So,
seems like a good ending to
but
me,
I look forward to talking about this more, Colleen. I think it's going to be, we mentioned a number of things that we can come back to.
Definitely.
And we need to come back to. And I know that we will. So, but let's pray for people like Mr. Foley here. Mm-hmm. Let's pray for the Canadian veteran. And let's pray for many other people right now that are in these kinds of moments. And lastly, I would say this in closing, to our healthcare, vocation. Healthcare is in the service of human persons. It is not there to participate in the culture of death. And I would say to all of those in healthcare is, especially, not just to our Catholic brothers and sisters in healthcare, but to all, but specifically to our healthcare workers in Catholic care, is to understand the ethical and religious directives. So what we call the ERDs, the Ethical and Religious Directives of Healthcare, Catholic Healthcare, is promulgated by the Catholic Conference of Bishops. They can go online and look them up. It's 77 principles of the Church's understanding of Catholic healthcare that begins with the dignity of the human person at every stage. And that's what I would encourage our readers, not just those in healthcare, all of us to be familiar with.
Well, thank you so much, Father.
You're welcome.
For everyone listening on YouTube and Rumble, please like and subscribe. For anyone listening on the audio platforms, please follow, share with your friends. And as always, if you have any topics that you'd like covered in future podcasts, please drop them in the comments. We would love to be able to have podcasts about topics that are pertinent to you. So, thank you. Have a great day and keep on living the culture of life.